Well, it's a privilege to be here. I picked that song because it expresses what we're all talking about today. Every life belongs to us, not just those who are our husband or wife or girlfriend, boyfriend, or family member, but every life. It's good to be here among friends who understand the pro-life mission, the sacred trust that we have to respect the life God gives us and protect the vulnerable at any age. Because the dear Lord is the Creator, and He is here with us now. We need to keep a sense of wonder alive, along with the love that opens our hearts and guides the mind. Love not just for those who belong to us, but for all throughout the earth. And that love rises in us when we open to His love. Well, I've been asked to explain, is hospice pro-life or is it culture of death? I'm probably going to shock some, offend others, and hopefully inspire some to act. And many of the things that were said by the other speakers are right within my heart, too. We must confront the reality that there is suffering in life, especially at the end of life. We cannot escape it, nor can we prevent others from suffering totally and protect them from suffering at all. But we can care and serve and relieve what we can. It is the privilege of healthcare professionals to serve all humbly without regard to any differences among us. And they teach nurses and doctors and other health professionals to have empathy for the patient, listening, being open to learn from them, to have unconditional love for all, and this is the basis for that ability. And the mission to serve, especially in healthcare, is truly a spiritual mission. Removing the spiritual element from healthcare is a dangerous step that invites all sorts of problems we've seen in history. One of the best examples of service is Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Many years of service to the homeless, the dying, the unwanted. And she's one of my inspirations, who said, "What I do, you cannot do, but what you do, I cannot do. The needs are great, and none of us, including me, ever do great things. But we can do small things with great love, and together we can do something wonderful." We're all called to serve in some way according to the gifts given to us, our abilities in our own circle, and it needs only be done with great attentiveness and love. Even though it is sometimes difficult, we must renew our efforts to serve in our own way. In our own lives, we struggle to find meaning and to live a virtuous life. We try to do the right thing. Sometimes we think about things like Thomas Aquinas, but most of us through faith as disciples of the Lord. But great meaning can be found in service by giving. Forgetting ourselves and losing ourselves in the work, we can find fulfillment when we focus on helping others in our way, wherever we are. All of us at some time resist God's call. Moses didn't want to go. Jonah didn't want to go, and you know where he ended up. We must overcome the resistance to God's call. We also seek to protect the vulnerable, the defenseless, and the unjustly victimized, as the prophet Moses did. And he also protected the shepherds and freed the Hebrew slaves, but he did it through God's power, not his own. Before we can protect the vulnerable, we must open our eyes to see what is really going on. It is easier to pretend there is no problem, but then we'll have failed to answer the call. Just this morning at 2 a.m., I received a phone call from an RN in New York who was a professional. She was very well educated, but her mother was in hospice, and her mother did not have pain issues but was getting morphine. She was not agitated. She was being sedated. She was being killed. And so I talked with her about what to do. This may be shocking to some of you to even hear that hospice could do such a thing, because contrary to the mission of hospice as it's been told to the public or marketed to the public. The issues we confront today are not new. Thousands of years ago, and since Plato proposed his eugenics program to select which people could reproduce and who could not, and aristocratic control, elite control over what happened in society, we face the same issues. And some would neglect the ailing to hasten their death. And this is not the way for a caring society. The context of our struggle must be understood, and the realities of end-of-life care, as well as abortion and so on, will be seen very clearly. We cannot find our way or the complete truth without the light and help from the Lord. This is not just the death dealers against those who are pro-life. What we are dealing with is an ongoing conflict with those consumed with darkness, fighting against the light. Those aligned with evil, refusing to allow God's goodness to open their eyes and guide them. And those eager to deal out death, attacking the lives of the vulnerable, as well as those who embrace the pro-life mission and respect the sanctity of life. They're fighting them. There is real hatred by those who promote the culture of death for those who are pro-life. All pro-life leaders have been attacked or shunned in some way. Their voices have been suppressed in the media and in the high places of power. And to understand the truth and why this is so, we must not only be open-minded, but open to see how what we do or do not do contributes to the problem. We also need to open our eyes and not be naive about the realities of life, the sometimes cruel and heartless actions of some in the world. I will touch on some of the major developments that have brought us to a low point in the battle for life. Those who bring a vision to the people are like lighthouses, guiding ships to safe harbor. They receive light from above, inspiration and strength, and share it with all, and they ask nothing for themselves. But there are also those who would destroy the lighthouses and allow the ships to run aground and then plunder them like pirates. Not everyone wants what we want. Not everyone wants to allow people to live at all or to live until a natural death occurs in God's own timing. And just as pirates plunder the ships, businesses in healthcare can exploit the system for their own gain. Medicare and Medicaid fraud are rampant and easily perpetrated. Healthcare agencies can enrich themselves at the expense of the taxpayer and to the harm of the patients. We need to remember that healthcare as an industry consists of people who are imperfect just like any other industry, people who are subject to greed and worse. Hospice is no different. You may have been told differently than that. However good many hospice doctors, nurses, and others are working in the field, there are some who are not, and we cannot and must not be naive about the reality. To protect the pro-life mission of hospice, we must first see what threatens it and then act to stop it. Years ago, I believed that the system of inspections and the legal system kept the healthcare industry in line, just as we are led to believe. But in 1997, when I saw intentional fraud, Medicare fraud, occurring at the large hospice in Michigan where I worked, directly confronting the administration showed me they not only would not stop exploiting the patients for gain, they told me that nothing serious would happen to them. They didn't care, and they were right that nothing would happen to them. I became a whistleblower and founded the Hospice Patients Alliance. Sometimes we are misled to believe that because we are told, judge not, that we should not discern between right and wrong or judge actions we see around us. Everything can be turned around, Bible quotes for sure. We may not judge the souls of others, but we certainly must judge the actions of those around us and promote those that are in line with respecting life. Many wonderful nurses and doctors who work with those at the end of life are not aware of the havoc and harm being caused by many in this industry. They may become offended, and have, when I and others expose the dark side of this industry. They cannot imagine anyone doing what they would never do. I did not want to believe what I saw for myself. It's shocking to imagine, let alone see happening right in front of you. But the truth must be brought out, a reality that has been censored for years at every level of the media. You may wonder why it has been censored. I've been in touch with ABC Diane Sawyer's assistant, investigative reporter Terry Shahari, NBC Dateline producer Alan Moranis, assistant, as well as himself, Washington Times reporter Dan Gabriel over the past several years, and others. In each case, they investigated for a few months, confirmed the reports from families that I put them in touch with, and the problems in hospice. But the editors high up killed the story every time. That's why you haven't read them. In 1998, I worked with then Washington Post reporter Chuck Babcock, who wrote the story Hospice Big Business Thanks to Medicare. Why has it become a big business? Well, billions of Medicaid and Medicare dollars are saved through the use of hospice compared to acute hospital care. The government wants utilization of hospice to increase every year till close to 100% of us die in a hospice rather than a hospital. When a patient is hastened to their death, the government saves even more, even on Social Security that need not be paid out. That explains why the government doesn't want any negative information coming out about hospice. They don't want to discourage the use of hospice. What about local media? Why won't they cover the story? Well, hospice as a business industry has positioned itself very cleverly, and I mean really very cleverly. They pay for ads in the local media and enlist the help of the local radio, TV, and newspapers to fundraise each year. Their boards of directors include the very powerful business leaders and politicians in every town, in every city. The media is not going to expose wrongdoing in their own local hospices, which are often portrayed as angelic workers. And many of them are great workers, very dedicated. Well, many of the nurses and doctors who work in this field are dedicated. They work hard to relieve the suffering of the terminally ill. But so are healthcare workers in other niches of healthcare. And hospice workers consist of individual human beings, just like any other industry. It is not immune to having its own set of problems, like the well-known problems in nursing homes and hospitals. From the media coverage, you would think that hospice had no problems. Can you think of an article that exposed something negative about hospice? Hard to find one. It is the sacred cow of healthcare. Bringing out abuse in hospice is something no major newspaper has really touched, though they all are aware of the realities, they just censor the story. To understand what hospice is and how we got to where we are, we need to remember three giants in the end-of-life care arena. Dame Cicely Saunders of London, England, Florence Wald, Dean of Nursing at Yale University School of Nursing, and the Swiss psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. We need to understand that hospice is the place where end-of-life care is provided, whether in our own homes, a nursing home, or any facility. Palliative care is a broad type of health care that focuses on relieving symptoms at any stage of life. But at the end of life, it focuses on relieving the symptoms of the incurable terminal illness. Dame Cicely Saunders is the founder of the modern hospice movement. She was a nurse, a medical social worker, and then a physician. She had an amazing career. In 1967, she opened St. Christopher's Hospice in London, named after the saint who carried people across the river to the other side. As a Christian, her focus was on a holistic approach to caring for the dying, including maintaining good pain control and relief of symptoms at the end of life. Through her work, Saunders advanced the care of the dying by many light years, and that great mission is truly a blessing to the patients and families at the end of life. Every family member will face the problems of confronting death and symptoms that may arise at the end stage of an illness. It is not always pretty, and I can tell you many stories about that. The second giant of the hospice movement was Florence Wald, who opened the first American hospice in 1974. She was inspired by Saunders, but was an agnostic and was in favor of assisted suicide. Saunders said, I know that I differ from Cicely Saunders, who is very much against assisted suicide. I disagree with her view on the basis that there are cases in which either the pain or the debilitation the patient is experiencing is more than can be borne. And listen carefully to this part. Whether that pain is, whether it be economically, physically, emotionally, or socially. For this reason, I feel a range of options should be available, and this should include assisted suicide. So she was saying, you can kill somebody because there's an economic hardship, maybe for the family, for society, the state. It's very scary when you think about it. She also said there are cases in which either the pain or the it's a similar quote, sorry. Okay, anyway. While hospice has marketed itself as the type of hospice that Cicely Saunders brought to the world, the American hospice leadership is largely influenced by Florence Wald, who was in favor of assisted suicide. They are absolutely not dedicated to the pro-life approach as you have been led to believe. They have a different vision of hospice, which is very fast becoming a reality throughout the country. The third giant in the end-of-life arena is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote On Death and Dying in 1969, which detailed the 5 stages of grief. You may have heard these: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and final acceptance of impending death, which help us understand the patient's grief at the impending loss of their own life, as well as the grief of family members from the beginning of the terminal diagnosis through death and afterwards. So how did we as a society get from Dame Cicely Saunders' Christian vision of hospice to hospice where death is hastened? I have received calls and letters over 12 years from families and terminally ill patients from all over the country about all sorts of problems in hospice. Sometimes there isn't enough pain control, or the nurses are not there when needed. Sometimes the patient is sedated when they don't want to be, or they are being overdosed with morphine or some other opioid like fentanyl. These medications are a blessing when patients are in real extreme pain, but in many cases they may not be needed and should not be forced upon the patient. Sometimes problems arise because the physicians will not write the order for sufficient pain medication, and this is an area that everybody in the healthcare industry is working to resolve. However, when the nurse at the bedside is the one who records what is happening in the medical record, if they have an agenda, they can falsify the medical record to justify giving more pain medication than needed. And every nurse and doctor knows the medical record is the legal record. So if they chart something happened that didn't happen, or the patient had pain when they didn't have pain, that's what the state inspectors are going to look at, and they'll say the patient had pain, therefore the pain medications were justified, even though the patient had no pain and was killed because of the morphine that they gave through lying. For example, the patient is not agitated or in severe pain, but the nurse charts the patient is in severe pain or is agitated. They give the pain medication and sedatives using standing doctor orders. There are a long list of standing orders the nurse can give based on the symptoms they see. The doctor trusts the nurse to follow and be honest. If the patient is continued on these medications, they're induced into a medically induced coma. They sleep. They look peaceful, but they die of dehydration within less than 2 weeks. And there are people in this room who have experienced this, who have seen this. I can't tell you how many times I've received calls from family members who reported that their loved one had been enrolled in hospice with a terminal illness but was not at the very end stage, active phase of dying. They tell me often about their loved one eating, drinking, talking, walking, even going shopping. In other words, they were living their lives out, still interacting socially with others. And the hospice nurse came out and the patient died within an hour or a day. These are not natural deaths. People don't suddenly die without warning in most diseases, except for AIDS patients, which I've seen. who can die very abruptly. They could be talking to you and they die instantly. But cancer patients and most other patients, they do not die like that. And if they die suddenly and it's not AIDS, it's a big red flag. It could be a medical killing. Some may say they were lay people. They don't understand hospice. Well, the people who call me are often professionals, family members who were nurses, doctors, and other professionals. Last night I got a call from an RN. She knew her stuff. The hospice nurses were yelling at her, trying to make her shut up and allow them to do what they were doing. These professionals are not uneducated. Even they were unable to prevent death being imposed upon their loved one because they trusted the nurses and doctors who spoke to them. And we normally do trust the healthcare professionals, but we need to be vigilant, and you need to tell others to be vigilant. I've had calls from hospice medical directors, one I think probably about 6 months. He quit being a hospice medical director because the nurses were misusing his doctor orders to kill patients. He found out the patient didn't have pain, and they gave the morphine and so on. Nursing directors and administrators of hospices have called me. They have confirmed these problems that I'm talking about are widespread. There are some good hospices, and those hospices sometimes get patients transferred from the other hospices if the families are vigilant and smart enough to figure out they have to get out of there and get to a good another hospice. In many cases, they tell me they had misgivings about the doses of morphine that were given. Sometimes a nurse will tell them that morphine will help the patient breathe. Well, the reality is morphine may relax a patient, but it actually suppresses breathing, slows it down, and may actually stop breathing altogether. And the signs of the adverse effects of morphine are exactly the same, or some of the signs of active phase of dying at the very end stage: decreased blood pressure, slow breathing, and death. Rather than giving oxygen, some hospice nurses just increase the morphine. The families report that the nurse tells them, "He's going to die today." And they're absolutely sure, even though the patient does not have the signs of active phase of dying. Their hands or feet could be cold, the knees sometimes blue or purple. There are certain signs, if you've worked with dying people, you know they're imminently dying when they have these signs. But they don't have it. How can the nurse tell them they're definitely dying today? Because they're doing it. In a natural death, you can't be sure. And what happens, even when patients do have signs of active phase of dying, some patients surprise us. I remember a patient whose blood pressure was down to about 40/20 or something like that. Everybody came from California and all around the country, and they kept vigil the whole night. They said, "This is definitely it. She's definitely dying." In the morning, she opened her eyes and said, "Where's breakfast?" And she lived another 6 months. So these things happen. No doctor or nurse can absolutely know what's going to happen. And if they tell you they can, they're lying. Sometimes problems arise because the physicians will not write the order for sufficient pain medication. Okay, and we covered that. But sometimes a family member who is eager to inherit the estate and the house will enlist hospice to take care of their elderly parent. And they make sure that very strong doses are given till the patient dies. Other family members call me distraught that their loved one was hastened to their death. But this is something you need to know. It is the person who has the power of attorney, who has that power of attorney, who the hospice will listen to, even if other family members object. So say you've got a father or a mother who remarries, and you're their adult child, and they bring in hospice, and they tell them, give these medications. You, as their child, can do nothing because that other person has the power of attorney. It's very important for the person who has the power of attorney to be pro-life and to share the values of the patient. Those who seek to inherit may sweet-talk their way into becoming that power of attorney, and then they make sure the patient dies sooner rather than caring for them. There are 1,000 ways to impose death. You may be surprised, but anyone who's a nurse here or a doctor, there are standards of care how to do every little thing. And when I first was trained as a nurse, I was thinking, oh, you know, you're so picky. Why do you have to do this way, and you have to hold things this way, and sterile technique and clean technique? But I know of a case in California where the nurse, who was what we call a closer, he killed patients. He used dirty technique on a trach, the tracheotomy opening here into that goes down to the throat and caused infection. You can also use dirty technique on a urinary catheter and cause sepsis, and they can die from that if they're not treated for the infection. There's all sorts of things you can do. I know a nurse when I was in hospice who he took a cartridge. There are cartridges of morphine solution for the IV pumps that they use, and he got a cartridge that was twice the strength of what the doctor ordered, and that was harmful, obviously, to the patient until we discovered it. Otherwise, the patient would have died. There's something as simple in the very end, when the patient is very, very weak, sometimes you don't move them. If you pull them up, and this guy, I was very new, he said, grab the sheet, pull her up in bed, and she died that instant. And I knew, only later did I realize he intended to kill her because her and the family, they were sharing those precious moments at the end of life. And you rob the family and the patient of those moments when you do these things. There was a nurse in Florida, Candy, and I'm going to talk about a Catholic hospital in Fort Lauderdale. There's only one, but this was happening there. Her grandmother was in the hospital, and she had gotten sedated, so she had trouble swallowing. But she did not have real swallowing problems. So they said, well, and this is very common nowadays, sedate the patient can't swallow, so they say, well, you can't give that patient anything by mouth. No liquid, no food, and they were supposed to put in a tube feeding, but they weren't putting in the tube. Days and days were going by, so Candy called me, and this is probably 6 years ago. So I called the nursing desk, and I said, well, I know what you're doing. You can't talk about it because of the privacy rules, but if you continue to do this, we will report every single one of you nurses to the Board of Nursing and the doctors because you're killing the patient against the patient's wishes. And I said, talk to your risk management department. And that patient, they started giving the fluid. They brought her back, and she lived another 2 years. But we don't always get calls soon enough to save someone. COPD patients, for example, with emphysema, they have very poor breathing effort. If they get morphine, they die like flies. They're very sensitive to morphine. So they have such a weak breathing effort that morphine, if it is given, has to be given very, very carefully. And many of them are hastened to death. Misapplying interventions that are covered or correct at a later stage, if you apply them sooner, if you have the wrong timing for an intervention, that can kill someone. At the very end stage, when someone's in the active phase of dying, their tongue is cleaving to their mouth, the roof of their mouth. They're dry. They can't swallow anything. You can't throw pills down their throat. They would choke on that. And so often you stop their regular medications. And some of them you might give rectally or through another route. But if it's at the very, very end, they don't give them because it's not going to make a difference. They're in a catabolic state. Their body is shutting down. But if you do that prematurely and you take a chronically ill patient who's stable, like they have hypertension or they have heart disease, and you take away their medications, they may stroke out. They may have heart failure when they were stable, precipitating the crisis from which they die. And then the hospice nurses can say, see, they were dying, but they did it, and this is happening. So you have to be careful. Don't let them take those medications away unless it's really, really the very, very end. Changes in society come with a price. Now I'm going to get into part of how this arose. When agrarian societies became industrialized in the 1800s, people moved away from the farms and often away from extended families. Christian families are often extended families. But even in our society, we can't manage to keep our families together. Maybe we don't like our extended family. We want to do our own thing and have our own family, a nuclear family. But when you have a nuclear family with only one parent working, there is time to care for the children and for the elderly parents. But since the 60s, we have traditional nuclear families on the decline, often with both husband and wife working, or single-parent families. And when a parent becomes ill, who can give up work to care for them? You're endangering your own nuclear family to go care for your elderly, ailing parent. Abandoning the family structure has created difficulty to care for them. And while Christians and those of other faiths value family, socialists and utilitarians or atheists do not. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 just as industrialization flourished. He argued for the destruction of the family and religion as necessary steps towards his socialist ideal. However, the American vision is based in faith in God, our Creator, in the value of the individual and freedom for each individual to live and find their own way without intrusive state control. The founders said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But since the time of Karl Marx, there have been others who have taken up his cause. The leadership has been composed of atheists and those who condemn those who have faith. They have often led their nations into totalitarian states rather than the utopia followers hoped for. From the 1930s through the 60s and into the present day, efforts have been made to legalize euthanasia, unsuccessfully here in the United States, but successfully in the Netherlands, for example. The Euthanasia Society of America was formed in 1938, and it's never stopped since. Those who propose eugenics have also been working to shape society by killing the unwanted and choosing who should be allowed to live. Nothing new, as Plato proposed the same thing over 2,000 years ago. Many physicians have studied the works of Plato and are influenced by his proposals and lack of respect for life. With the economic disaster hitting Germany after World War I, socialists there were welcomed and eugenics and euthanasia were practiced. The Nazis' T4 program, 1939 to 44, ruthlessly eliminated the mentally ill, disabled, and ailing, killing them outright. Economic pressures caused some to question caring for these groups. Killing with morphine was perfected by the Nazi doctors. The Euthanasia Society became the Society for the Right to Die and gave us DNR documents, advance directives, and then the organization renamed itself in 1991 Choice in Dying, which merged with a hospice organization, Partnership for Caring, which then merged with Last Acts, another hospice organization, which was then absorbed by the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. You don't know that, but hospice as a national organization in this country is directly linked to the Euthanasia Society, legally and corporately. If the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization was pro-life, as Dame Cicely Saunders was, it would never have had anything to do with the successor organizations of the Euthanasia Society of America, but it did. The leadership is filled with pro-euthanasia, pro-assisted suicide leaders, as well as those who propose and practice the third way of killing, without asking for permission to euthanize or assist people to the death. They terminally sedate patients. This is the third way, including inducing a coma till the patient dehydrates and dies, even when the patient has no agitation. In many hospices, every patient is given morphine and Ativan, a sedative. One volunteer who was pro-life called me upset and reported she was shocked to see every patient sleeping at the hospice facility. She asked the charge nurse, who told her, "All patients who come here are agitated. Therefore, all of them are sedated." And of course, once they're sedated, they don't drink, and after 1 to 2 weeks or less, they die from dehydration. Now, the most important end-of-life documents you could possibly fill out is the healthcare proxy to name who will serve as the power of attorney. As I mentioned before, the DNR could be helpful at the end of life when treatment is not going to be helpful and you truly are dying. Advance directives can be helpful to say what kind of care you want. But it is a one-way street. The 1990 Patient Self-Determination Act mandates that advance directives like living wills be available, and healthcare agencies are supposed to honor them. But if you want treatment or care, your wishes can be, and often are, denied. You may wonder why or how it's possible. Again, we have to go back to the socialists, the atheists, who have shaped our modern society and government policy. The Frankfurt School of Socialists, back in Germany in the early 60s and in America, had tremendous impact on world thought, resulting directly in the Cultural Revolution. These were the people who created the counterculture, the people who you never even heard of, or if you heard of them, you didn't really know what they were doing. The counterculture of the 60s. Erich Fromm was one of the most popular writers from the Frankfurt School. Herbert Marcuse, one of its leaders, wrote of the Great Refusal. Well, what are they refusing? Refusal to honor traditional values and common standards of decency led to increased drug and alcohol abuse, casual sex without the commitment of marriage, rejection of faith and traditional family, and a consequent dependence on government welfare and aid, exactly what the socialists wanted. I lived through those times. Once the counterculture of the 60s shook society, the time was ripe for replacement of our nation's Christian roots with a secular vision. So in 1974, our Congress, through the National Research Act, commissioned several individuals to craft guidelines for research on the fetus. The guidelines have come to be known as the Belmont Report, and you can look this up. Please remember the Belmont Report, which contained a government-mandated secular ethics or federal ethics. These federal ethics became the law of the land, basically determining not only how research on a fetus could be done, but how decisions are made throughout the healthcare system and everywhere in government. Ideas of justice, what they call justice, autonomy, and beneficence sound good, but when you closely examine them, one finds they undermine the very foundation of American life as envisioned in our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Professor of Law at University of California, Berkeley, David Louisel, was the lone dissenter on the commission, and he warned back in 1975 that these federally mandated ethics were dangerous. He wrote, "American society is itself at risk, the risk of losing its dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. We may have to learn once again that when the bell tolls for the lost rights of any human being, even the politically weakest, it tolls for all." And how true that is. That was 1975. He saw it, and most of us never even knew. The federal ethics were implemented through the U.S. Public Health Department, the state health departments, the local health departments, as well as all university research centers, the medical schools, and nursing schools. The entire healthcare system is filled with these secular ethics. A doctor may choose to follow Christian ethics or Jewish ethics, but this is what was taught to them. We must remind ourselves of the words of our nation's founders, which I had just read, and remember them, and try to think about the contrast between the secular values and our founders' values. In 1776, it was self-evident to the founders. But now people question these basic truths. They are indoctrinated to believe otherwise. They think nothing of depriving people of life, babies, unborn or even born, disabled, like Terry Schiavo, or the elderly or ailing, or those with Alzheimer's patients, whether through the killing of unique individuals before or at birth or at the end of life. Often when those concerns are raised, people say, well, they were dying anyway. They were terminal. But ask yourself, if you got a terminal diagnosis or your loved one got one, would you want to die right then and there, or would you want to find a way to live longer, to be with those you love? Most patients have a tremendous will to live, and yes, there is a time to let go when death truly approaches. So you see, there is a stark contrast between the traditional Christian values and what is being steadily pushed forward by those elites in power who are shaping our nation's policy. In 1999, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA, was passed, finally becoming effective April 14, 2003. And I personally filed the very first complaint under HIPAA to the United States government against the hospice of the Florida Suncoast, the same hospice that later executed the non-terminal disabled woman Terry Schindler-Schiavo. This hospice had violated the privacy of hundreds of hospice patients by using the patient's real diagnosis and information in its subsidiary software company, Suncoast Solutions. They had people with AIDS and cancer and all sorts of diagnoses listed with their real names, telephone numbers, and addresses. I actually called some of them, an AIDS patient was one of them, to confirm that this was true, and I did. My complaint under HIPAA was never addressed. HIPAA's privacy rule is not enforced against agencies, and I know it directly for a fact, and no government individual or representative can tell me different. They would lie if they said any different. It is used to give the public the illusion of privacy, but what is really going on with HIPAA is secrecy. There is no way to research all the medical records and cases to determine how many patients have been killed. Each patient faces the possibility of receiving good care, but they also may face an imposed death, a hastened death. This has become the invisible Holocaust, and easily, I am certain, there are 100,000 minimum patients hastened to death in our country every year, and probably twice or three times that amount. That same hospice of the Florida Suncoast is a leader among the nation's hospices. When Terry's life was being debated in court, Bob Schindler and the rest of Terry's family had no real idea what they were caught up in. Terry was used to create a legal precedent for executing the disabled, and it was done in front of the whole world. Terry was not brain dead. She never had a heart attack and did not have an eating disorder. I have the medical record. I've seen them. Her own physician testified under oath that she was perfectly healthy physically, except for a severe brain injury and injury to her neck that made it hard for her to turn her neck to one side. I will leave it to you to figure out how a healthy woman ends up with a severe brain injury and severe permanent neck injury without falling. Think about it. George Philos, a euthanasia proponent, was the attorney for Michael Schiavo, but he was also chairman of the board of the hospice. If hospice is not associated with euthanasia proponents, how did he end up chairman of the board of one of the most powerful and largest hospices in our country. How did the CEO, Mary Labiak, end up on the board of Partnership for Caring, a successor organization to the Euthanasia Society? Mary Labiak, CEO of the hospice and willing participant in Terry's execution, was also a leading board member of the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. Right to Life groups have long viewed hospice as the safe alternative to euthanasia, assisted suicide, as they should be, and are in many cases. But tragically, more and more of the hospices are dangerous havens for those practicing euthanasia through overdoses or through terminal sedation. Again, you may ask, if this is true, how come the police don't intervene? How come those criminals aren't prosecuted? Isn't it clear now the sanctity of life ethic has been replaced completely at the government and policy level by the quality of life ethic? Many of you have heard the language, his quality of life was so poor we had to let him go. It was better this way, he was suffering. But people lied to themselves and others. Often they didn't let him go, they pushed him into death, and it's not the same as allowing a natural death in God's timing. The police and district attorneys view the death of a terminally ill patient as a health care matter. They don't get involved. If you shoot someone with a gun, they will. But if you have a motive, means, and opportunity but kill with morphine, they do nothing. There have been thousands of reports to the police with no action. District attorneys know that hospice is to be encouraged, that the local hospice board includes local business leaders, the wealthy and powerful in their community. If they have any political aspirations, and almost every district attorney does, they know to stay away from any hospice case. In 1998, CBS 60 Minutes 2 did the only major story that I'm aware of, entitled A Question of Homicide, in which 19 hospice deaths, the coroner's office in Volusia County, Florida, ruled officially 19 deaths were homicides due to morphine overdose. These coroners, medical doctors, went way out on the limb, and they were certain that these were homicides. They referred it to the district attorney, and the district attorney refused to prosecute. So what did they do? They fired the coroners, they harassed the third forensic scientist who was a civil servant, and they gave it to a state commission of hospice doctors that ruled them all natural deaths. So families have no access to criminal courts, and civil attorneys will not take the case of such a death because the monetary value of a terminally ill patient is nil because they have no earning capacity. So people call me and say, well, what can I do? No attorney will take the case, even if they have an autopsy, even if they prove it. So there's no access to the courts, civil or criminal, and the hospices know they can do anything they want. So euthanasia is de facto legal in every county in this country, and that is the fact.